The gavel's sharp crack hadn't even faded from the mahogany walls of courtroom 302 before David let out a low, mocking laugh. It was the sound of a man who firmly believed he held the world by its throat. Beside him, his high-priced attorney smirked, confidently shuffling the fabricated documents meant to leave Sarah destitute, homeless, and stripped of her 7-year-old son. Through the suffocating tension, Sarah sat completely motionless. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her silence unnerving. She didn't weep. She didn't scream. She simply waited for the bailiff to dim the overhead lights. She waited for the evidence projector to hum to life. And she waited for the exact second the DNA results would hit the screen, turning her husband's arrogant laughter into a breathless, horrifying choke. The air conditioning in the Cook County Family Court building was notoriously unreliable. But on this Tuesday morning, courtroom 302 felt as cold as a morgue. Judge Helen Gallagher, a woman with 30 years of bench experience and a reputation for having zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, peered over her reading glasses. She looked at the 2 tables before her. At the plaintiff's table sat David Harrison. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit, David looked less like a man fighting for the custody of his only child and more like a CEO about to close a hostile takeover, which, in his mind, was exactly what this was. Beside him sat Richard Sterling, a ruthless divorce attorney known in Chicago's elite circles as the Butcher. Sterling was currently on his feet, pacing the space in front of the judge's bench, weaving a tragic tale of a devoted husband betrayed by a deceitful wife. "Your Honor!" Sterling's voice boomed, rich with feigned sorrow. "My client has endured the ultimate betrayal. For 7 years, Mr. Harrison poured his heart, his soul, and his considerable financial resources into raising a boy he believed to be his own. Only to discover, through a devastating anonymous tip, that his wife, Sarah, had been carrying on a sordid affair with a former colleague, Peter Hayes. At the defense table, Sarah Harrison sat in absolute silence. She wore a simple navy blue sheath dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe, neat clasp. She didn't flinch at the mention of Peter Hayes, a man who was happily married, lived in Seattle, and whom she hadn't spoken to in nearly 9 years. Under the stipulations of the prenuptial agreement, Sterling continued, infidelity on the part of Mrs. Harrison triggers the total forfeiture clause. No alimony, no division of assets. And given the severe emotional trauma inflicted upon my client, we are petitioning for sole physical and legal custody of the minor child, Leo, with supervised visitation for the mother, pending a psychological evaluation. It was a masterclass in legal assassination. David leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs casually. He turned his head slightly toward Sarah, catching her eye. A slow, cruel smile spread across his handsome face. He let out a soft, audible laugh. It was barely a breath, but in the quiet courtroom, it carried. It was a laugh that said, "I own you. I own this room. You are nothing." Sarah's attorney, a quiet, meticulous woman named Brenda Carmichael, placed a gentle hand on Sarah's forearm. Brenda didn't object. She didn't interrupt Sterling's grandstanding. She had strict instructions from her client. Let them talk. Let David dig the hole as deep as he possibly can. "We have submitted the DNA test results to the clerk, Your Honor," Sterling announced, holding up a sealed manila envelope. "Conducted by Geneticor Laboratories, a fully accredited facility. The results will conclusively prove that David Harrison possesses 0% probability of paternity regarding the child, Leo." Judge Gallagher frowned, adjusting her glasses. "Mrs. Carmichael, does the defense contest the admission of these specific lab results?" Brenda stood up slowly. "We do not object to the results being displayed, Your Honor. In fact, we request that they be projected on the courtroom monitors for full transparency. However, we also have our own sealed results from a court-appointed federal laboratory, which we would like to present immediately following the plaintiff's exhibit." Sterling scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Desperate delay tactics, Your Honor. The defense is trying to muddy the waters. I will allow it, Judge Gallagher ruled, her voice sharp. Bailiff, dim the lights. Let's see what Geneticore has to say. As the bailiff moved to the light switches, David leaned over the table, whispering so only Sarah could hear. You should have just signed the settlement, Sarah. Now you walk away with nothing. And Leo gets a real mother. He was talking about Clara Rossi, a 24-year-old former model he had been openly parading around Chicago for the last 6 months. Sarah turned her head slowly, meeting David's eyes. Her face was a masterclass in composure. She didn't offer a tear. She didn't offer anger. She just stared at him with a cold, deadpan expression that caused the smile to falter on his lips for a fraction of a second. The lights dimmed. The large LCD screens mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. The blue logo of Geneticore Laboratories appeared, followed by a scanned PDF document. David smirked, waiting for the killing blow. He had paid a laboratory technician named Greg Simmons $50,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency to swap the swabs. He knew exactly what the screen was going to say. But as the document scrolled down to the final conclusion, the courtroom went dead silent. David's eyes darted to the screen. He blinked. Once. Twice. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. There, in bold, undeniable black and white text, the report read, Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Conclusion. The alleged father, David Harrison, cannot be excluded as the biological father of the child, Leo Harrison. Sterling froze mid-breath. Wait, Your Honor, there must be a mistake. This is the wrong file. David slammed his hands on the table, half standing. What the hell is this? That's not what the report is supposed to say. His own words hung in the air, a damning admission of his own premeditated deception. The laugh was gone. In its place was a sheer, unadulterated panic. And the trial hadn't even reached Sarah's evidence yet. To understand the absolute silence of Sarah Harrison in that courtroom, one had to understand the 10 years of suffocating noise she had endured. A decade earlier, Sarah Jenkins had been a rising star at a boutique architectural firm in downtown Chicago. She was vibrant, fiercely independent, and possessed a quiet brilliance that commanded respect. She had met David at a charity gala she hadn't even wanted to attend. He was the heir to the Harrison real estate empire, charming, relentlessly attentive, and dangerously persuasive. Their courtship was a whirlwind of private jets, spontaneous trips to Paris, and grand gestures that left Sarah breathless. David made her feel like the center of the universe. But looking back, Sarah realized that the center of the universe is just another way of describing a target. The shift in David's behavior was so microscopic at first that Sarah didn't even recognize it as abuse. It started a month after their extravagant wedding. He subtly criticized her friends, planting seeds of doubt until she found herself distancing from them. He suggested she quit her demanding job to focus on building their life together, promising her she could start her own firm later with his backing. She agreed. It was the worst mistake of her life. Once she was financially dependent on him, the gilded cage slammed shut. David controlled the credit cards, reviewing every purchase she made down to the penny. If she bought a coffee at a cafe he didn't approve of, there was a lecture. If she wore a dress he deemed inappropriate, it mysteriously vanished from her closet. But the true nightmare began when Leo was born. David had initially been ecstatic about having an heir. But as Leo grew from an infant into a toddler, displaying Sarah's quiet, observant nature rather than David's boisterous aggression, David's interest waned. He began to view the child not as a son, but as a prop for family Christmas cards, a prop for impressing investors. Behind closed doors, David's emotional cruelty escalated. He became a master of gaslighting. He would hide Sarah's keys and watch her frantically search for them, only to find them in plain sight and sigh heavily about her declining mental state. He convinced his influential family and their elite social circle that Sarah was suffering from severe, untreated postpartum depression that had morphed into borderline personality disorder. "She's just so fragile," David would tell his mother over Sunday brunch, loudly enough for Sarah to hear from the kitchen. "I have to handle everything. I don't know what she would do without me." Sarah began to believe she was going crazy. She felt isolated, paranoid, and utterly exhausted. She stayed for Leo. She became a ghost in her own 20,000-square-foot mansion, walking on eggshells, speaking only when spoken to, perfecting the art of being invisible so as not to trigger David's sudden, terrifying outbursts of rage. The breaking point occurred 2 years ago during a summer retreat at their Hamptons estate. David had been drinking heavily. He demanded Sarah sign a post-nuptial agreement that would essentially waive her rights to any joint property if a divorce were to occur, under the guise of protecting the family trust from her mental instability. When Sarah hesitated, asking to have her own lawyer review it, David's mask slipped completely. He backed her against the marble kitchen island, his eyes cold and dead. "You don't get a lawyer, Sarah," he whispered, his breath reeking of expensive scotch. "You are nothing without me. You have no money, no career, and no friends. If you ever try to leave me, I will crush you. I will take Leo, and I will hire enough experts to convince a judge you belong in a psychiatric ward. You will never see him again. Sign the paper." Terrified for her son, Sarah signed. For the next 2 years, she played the part of the broken, submissive wife perfectly. She let David believe he had completely crushed her spirit. She let him openly flirt with other women, eventually turning a blind eye when he rented a penthouse for his mistress, Clara Rossi. David thought her silence was a sign of total defeat. He mistook her lack of resistance for a lack of intelligence. He forgot that before she was Mrs. David Harrison, she was an architect, and architects know exactly how to find the weak, load-bearing walls in a structure, and exactly where to place the explosives to bring the whole house down. The demolition of David Harrison's carefully constructed life began 6 months before the court date, on a mundane Tuesday afternoon. David was in Tokyo on business, a trip Sarah knew involved Clara Rossi, given the charge on the secondary Amex for 2 first-class tickets. While he was away, Sarah was in his home office, searching for Leo's birth certificate for a school soccer registration. David was meticulous, but arrogance breeds sloppiness. He had left his secondary briefcase unlocked beneath his mahogany desk. Inside, Sarah didn't find the birth certificate. Instead, she found a burner phone and a ledger. Her heart pounding in her throat, she opened the ledger. It was filled with cryptic notes, but one page caught her eye. It listed an address for Geneticor Laboratories, a sum of $50,000, and a name, Greg Simmons. Beside it was written, Leo DNA, negative. Sarah took the burner phone into the bathroom, locked the door, and turned on the shower to mask any noise. The phone wasn't password protected, another symptom of David's belief that he was untouchable. She scrolled through the text messages. There was a long thread with an unsaved number, which she quickly realized belonged to his lawyer, Richard Sterling. Sterling. The infidelity clause is the only way around the original prenup. The postnup is ironclad for assets, but custody is tricky given your travel schedule. We need fault. David. I'll give you fault. I'll say she's been screwing Peter Hayes since before Leo was born. Sterling. You need proof, David. I have a guy at a lab. We run a paternity test. He swaps my swab with a random sample. Boom, Leo isn't mine. She's a whore. I get total custody. Ship the kid to boarding school in Switzerland, and Clara and I take the house. Sterling. Risky. But if the lab certifies it, the court will accept it. Don't leave a paper trail. Sarah sat on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, the water from the shower running hot, filling the room with steam. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't enough for David to leave her. He wanted to destroy her entirely. He was willing to publicly disown his own flesh and blood just to save face and keep his fortune. A lesser woman might have screamed. She might have confronted him upon his return, demanding answers. Sarah did none of those things. She took out her own phone and meticulously photographed every page of the ledger and every text message on the burner phone. She then placed the phone and the ledger exactly where she had found them, down to the millimeter. The next day, she dropped Leo off at school and drove to a nondescript office building in a run-down part of the city. She didn't use a credit card or a trackable phone to find the man she was meeting. She had found his name on a dark web forum using a secure library computer weeks prior. Arthur Caldwell was a private investigator who specialized in taking down untouchable men. He was a former forensic accountant for the FBI who had been forced into early retirement for bending the rules. When Sarah walked into his office, dressed in sunglasses and a scarf, she laid a stack of cash on his desk, money she had been secretly hoarding for 3 years by skimming off her grocery allowance and selling her designer jewelry to high-end pawn shops, replacing them with flawless cubic zirconia replicas. "I need you to investigate my husband," Sarah said, her voice steady. "His name is David Harrison." Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "The real estate Harrison? Lady, if you're looking for proof of an affair, you're wasting your money. Everyone knows about his side pieces." "I don't care about his affairs," Sarah replied coldly. "I care about his fraud. I want everything. I want the shell companies. I want the offshore accounts. I want the dirt on a lab tech named Greg Simmons at Geneticor. But most importantly," she paused, looking Caldwell dead in the eye, "I need you to find out what David is hiding about his own past. A man who casually orchestrates a fake DNA test has lied about genetics before." Caldwell took the cash. Over the next 6 months, while David filed for divorce and the brutal legal machinery ground into motion, Sarah played the victim perfectly. She wept in mediation. She begged David to be reasonable. She let Richard Sterling walk all over her deposition. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Caldwell was digging, and what he unearthed was a secret so explosive it made the fake paternity test look like a parking ticket. David had indeed bribed Greg Simmons to fake the paternity test, but Caldwell discovered that Greg Simmons was already under federal investigation for tampering with forensic evidence. All Sarah had to do was anonymously forward the photographs of David's burner phone to the federal prosecutor handling Simmons' case. The FBI quietly raided Geneticor labs a week before the trial, seizing the servers and securing the original, unaltered DNA files. David's forged report was a dead man walking, and he had no idea. But that was just the appetizer. Caldwell had dug into David's private medical records. He had traced financial anomalies dating back 15 years, long before Sarah had ever met him. He had run cross-references on David's DNA, which Sarah had provided by clipping David's fingernails while he slept off a hangover. What Caldwell found changed everything, which brought them to this exact moment in courtroom 302. The moment David realized his fabricated plan had imploded. The moment his smug laugh died in his throat as the screen declared him the 99.99% biological father of Leo. "What the hell is this?" David was stammering, looking frantically at Sterling. "You said, you promised me. Mr. Harrison, sit down," Judge Gallagher barked, slamming her gavel. "Your own counsel submitted this evidence. Are you implying you expected a different result?" Sterling was frantically pulling at his collar. "Your Honor, we need a recess. We suspect the defense has somehow tampered with the lab. The defense hasn't touched a thing," Brenda Carmichael said, her voice ringing out clearly across the chaos. "But we are not finished. Your Honor, the plaintiff introduced DNA evidence to question paternity. By doing so, they have opened the door to genetic identity. We now ask to present our exhibit, the secondary DNA analysis conducted by the FBI Forensic Laboratory." David froze. The color that had just rushed back to his face drained away entirely. "FBI," he whispered. Sarah finally turned her head to look directly at him. For the first time in 10 years, the mask of the submissive, terrified wife vanished. In its place was the cold, calculating architect. She offered him a small, chilling smile. "Let's show the court who you really are, David," she said softly. "Bailiff," Judge Gallagher ordered, her eyes locked on David's panicked face. "Change the slide." The heavy silence in courtroom 302 was suddenly broken by the mechanical whir of the digital projector advancing to the next slide. In the back row of the public gallery, sitting entirely unnoticed in a rumpled brown trench coat, Arthur Caldwell leaned forward. The private investigator chewed on the inside of his cheek, watching the meticulously dressed David Harrison unravel in real time. Caldwell had spent 20 years hunting ghosts for the FBI before being forced out for his unorthodox methods. He knew what a cornered animal looked like, and the man sitting at the plaintiff's table, currently gripping the mahogany edge so hard his knuckles were white, was entirely cornered. The slide on the monitors didn't bear the blue logo of Geneticore Laboratories. Instead, it displayed the stark, uncompromising seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Criminal Justice Information Services Division. Judge Helen Gallagher leaned over her bench, squinting at the dense text. Her customary scowl deepened into a look of absolute bewilderment. "Mrs. Carmichael," the judge said, her voice dropping an octave in sheer disbelief, "would you care to explain exactly what I am looking at? Because if my eyes aren't deceiving me, this is a CODIS database cross-reference report." "Your eyes are perfectly fine, Your Honor," Brenda Carmichael replied smoothly, standing tall. "That is an official FBI forensic analysis. As you know, the plaintiff introduced genetic testing to question my client's fidelity and the paternity of the minor child, Leo. However, when my client grew suspicious of the plaintiff's secretive behaviors, she hired a private investigator to look into his background. We acquired a sample of the plaintiff's DNA, lawfully obtained from discarded fingernail clippings, and submitted it to an independent lab to verify the plaintiff's own genetic markers against the Harrison family lineage. Richard Sterling, the ruthless divorce attorney, was practically hyperventilating. "Objection! Your Honor, this is an outrageous breach of privacy. The defense is on a fishing expedition. They stole his DNA." "Abandoned property, Mr. Sterling," Brenda shot back without missing a beat. "Supreme Court precedent, California versus Greenwood, clearly states there is no reasonable expectation of privacy for discarded biological material. But the privacy of the fingernails is the least of your client's problems." Brenda turned to the screens, picking up a laser pointer. When the independent lab ran the plaintiff's DNA against commercial ancestry databases to establish a baseline, they found zero connection to the Harrison family tree, Brenda explained, her voice echoing in the stunned courtroom. No shared centimorgans with the late Jonathan and Eleanor Harrison. No connection to the extended Harrison cousins in Boston. In fact, the DNA showed the plaintiff has absolutely no genetic relationship to the Harrison bloodline whatsoever. David's breath hitched. He shot a frantic, venomous look at Sarah, who was sitting with her hands still neatly folded, her posture perfect, her face impassive. "A glitch," David hissed, his voice trembling. "It's a glitch in the system. Sterling, do something." "But it wasn't a glitch," Brenda continued, ignoring the outburst, "because the database did find a match. A perfect 100% familial match to a woman named Martha Reed in Dayton, Ohio. A woman who had a son named Thomas." Arthur Caldwell smiled grimly from the gallery. He remembered the exact night he had cracked the case open. It was 3 a.m., his office smelling of stale coffee and cheap cigars. He had been digging through the Ohio juvenile court archives, following a ghost. Caldwell's investigation had revealed that the real David Harrison, the introverted, socially awkward sole heir to the Harrison real estate fortune, had attended a private boarding school in Switzerland after his parents perished in a tragic helicopter crash when he was 14. The real David had a roommate, an American scholarship student from Ohio named Thomas Reed, a boy with a history of petty theft and a terrifyingly high IQ. The two boys, Caldwell discovered from old grainy yearbook photos, bore an uncanny, almost brotherly resemblance to one another. Both had the same sharp jawline, the same piercing blue eyes, the same build. According to the official records, Thomas Reed had died in a boating accident on Lake Geneva the summer after graduation. David Harrison had survived, returning to Chicago to claim his family's billion-dollar empire, drastically changed by the trauma of the accident. The previously shy, stuttering David was suddenly confident, ruthless, and aggressively charismatic. Everyone attributed it to grief and growing up. They were wrong. "Your Honor," Brenda Carmichael's voice cut through the courtroom, drawing every eye back to the screen. "We passed these findings to the FBI's white-collar crime division. They ran the DNA through CODIS. The results on your screen confirm that the man sitting at the plaintiff's table is not David Harrison. His real name is Thomas Reed. 15 years ago, the real David Harrison drowned in Switzerland. Thomas Reed assumed his identity, stole his passport, and returned to America to systematically drain the Harrison Trust. Pandemonium erupted. The gallery, populated mostly by law clerks and a few bored reporters, suddenly gasped and began whispering frantically. Clara Rossi, the 24-year-old mistress sitting in the second row, dropped her designer handbag. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, her meticulously contoured face frozen in horror as she stared at the man she thought was a billionaire. "Order!" Judge Gallagher roared, slamming her gavel repeatedly until it sounded like a machine gun. "Order in this court!" Richard Sterling looked like he was going to vomit. He physically backed away from David, or Thomas, as if the man were radioactive. A lawyer of Sterling's caliber thrived on technicalities and ruthlessness, but he did not do federal fraud. Representing a man who didn't legally exist was a one-way ticket to disbarment. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Gallagher said, her voice dangerously quiet now, a terrifying calm after the storm, "are you aware of the identity of the man sitting next to you?" "Your Honor, I assure the court, I am entirely blindsided by this," Sterling stammered, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I have known this man as David Harrison for 8 years. I drafted his corporate contracts. I need a recess. I need to confer with my client." "Your client?" Brenda Carmichael interjected sharply. "Which one, Mr. Sterling? Because if he is Thomas Reed, he has no legal claim to the Harrison fortune, meaning he cannot pay your retainer. And if he has been paying you with stolen trust funds, you are currently in possession of illicit federal assets." Sterling choked, his face turning a blotchy red. Thomas Reed, the man who had played the role of David Harrison for 15 years, finally snapped. The arrogant, composed facade shattered completely. He lunged across the table toward Sarah, his hands curled into claws. "You bitch!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a decade and a half of suppressed panic. "You set me up! You knew!" He didn't make it halfway across the table. Two court bailiffs, already on high alert from the escalating tension, tackled him. They slammed him back into his leather chair, pinning his arms behind his back. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't move away. She looked at the man who had tormented her, gaslighted her, and threatened to take her child away. She looked at him, not with fear, but with the cold, sterile curiosity of a scientist examining an insect under glass. "I knew," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I've known for 6 months, Thomas. And I let you pay a lab to fake a DNA test, just so you would walk into this courtroom and lock the doors behind yourself." The physical restraint by the bailiffs was nothing compared to the psychological paralysis that overtook Thomas Reed. He sat pinned in his chair, breathing heavily, his bespoke suit twisted and rumpled. The courtroom walls, lined with portraits of stern, dead judges, seemed to close in on him. His mind raced violently, spiraling back 15 years to a rain-slicked dock in Geneva. He remembered the real David slipping. He remembered the splash. He remembered standing there, watching the bubbles rise, realizing that if he just walked away, he could take the boy's wallet, his identity, his life. The real David had no immediate family left. The trustees in Chicago had only met the boy a handful of times. It was the perfect crime. And for 15 years, Thomas had played the part flawlessly. He had multiplied the Harrison fortune. He had become untouchable. Until he underestimated his wife. "Your Honor," Brenda Carmichael continued, her tone strictly professional, pulling the courtroom's attention back to the legal slaughter at hand. "Given that the plaintiff has been operating under a fraudulent identity, we submit that every legal document he has signed in the state of Illinois is null and void under the doctrine of fraud in the factum." Judge Gallagher, still staring at the CODIS report, slowly took off her reading glasses. "Continue, Mrs. Carmichael." 6 years ago, my client was coerced into signing a prenuptial agreement and later a post-nuptial agreement, effectively waiving her rights to all marital assets and severely limiting her custody rights, Brenda stated. However, the counterparty listed on those contracts is David Harrison. Since the man who signed those documents is actually Thomas Reed, the contracts are legally non-existent. Thomas let out a ragged breath. "You can't do that. The assets. The company." "The company," Brenda interrupted, turning her gaze to Thomas, "is exactly what we need to discuss next. Your Honor, I have here a secondary filing." She handed a thick, bound dossier to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "What is this?" Judge Gallagher asked, flipping open the cover. "That, Your Honor, is a certified whistleblower report filed with the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission, dated 4 months ago," Brenda explained. When my client discovered her husband's true identity, she realized that the Harrison real estate empire was technically being managed by an unauthorized, fraudulent entity. Worse, she uncovered that Mr. Reed was funneling legitimate corporate profits into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands to hide them from the Harrison Trust's board of directors. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out across the back of his neck. The Caymans. He had hidden those accounts behind 3 layers of encrypted corporate veils. How could she possibly know? He looked at Sarah. She finally offered him a small, chilling smile. "You always left your secondary briefcase unlocked in your study when you went to visit Clara, Thomas," Sarah said quietly. "You thought I was too stupid to understand ledger codes. You forgot I have a master's degree in architectural engineering and project management. Numbers are my native language." In the gallery, Arthur Caldwell let out a low, admiring whistle. Sarah Harrison wasn't just a survivor. She was an apex predator who had been playing dead. "Under the IRS whistleblower program," Brenda announced to the court, "an individual who provides actionable intelligence resulting in the recovery of stolen funds or unpaid taxes is entitled to up to 30% of the recovered assets." The FBI and the IRS froze all of Mr. Reed's offshore accounts at 6 a.m. this morning. Over $200 million. Richard Sterling slumped in his chair, putting his head in his hands. His career was over. The malpractice suits alone would bankrupt him. Furthermore, Brenda continued, driving the final nail into the coffin, for the last 7 years, my client has been acting as an uncredited architectural consultant on every major development project the Harrison firm has undertaken. Because Mr. Reed restricted her access to funds and forbade her from working officially, she quietly filed the patents and copyrights for her specific, innovative architectural designs under an LLC in her maiden name. An LLC that she fully owns. Judge Gallagher's eyebrows shot up to her hairline. "Are you telling me, Mrs. Carmichael, that the intellectual property driving the Harrison firm's current flagship projects is owned entirely by the defense?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brenda smiled. "Mr. Reed doesn't own the designs. He doesn't own the company. And as of this morning, he doesn't own a single bank account. He is a ghost, and ghosts do not get custody of 7-year-old boys." Thomas tried to stand again, but the bailiffs pushed him down hard. "You took everything!" He spat at Sarah, tears of pure, unadulterated rage welling in his eyes. "I built that company. I made it 10 times what that weak, stuttering idiot David could have ever made it." The admission echoed off the mahogany walls. It was a confession. spoken on the official court record. Judge Gallagher's face hardened into a mask of judicial fury. "Mr. Reed, you have just confessed to wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny in my courtroom. You came in here today intending to strip a mother of her child using falsified medical records, all while hiding behind the stolen name of a dead man." The judge slammed her gavel, pointing it directly at Thomas. "This family court matter is hereby suspended," Judge Gallagher boomed. "I am granting sole physical and legal custody of the minor child, Leo, to Sarah Jenkins, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am issuing a bench warrant for your arrest, Mr. Reed, pending federal indictment for identity theft, perjury, and fraud. Bailiff, place this man in handcuffs." The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in courtroom 302 was the sweetest sound Sarah had ever heard. Thomas Reed was hauled to his feet. As he was being dragged towards the side door leading to the holding cells, he looked desperately toward the gallery. "Clara!" he yelled. "Clara! Call my secondary lawyer! Get to the penthouse!" But the second row was empty. Clara Rossi, seeing the writing on the wall and the total vaporization of her sugar daddy's wealth, had slipped out of the courtroom 5 minutes earlier. She was already in a cab headed to O'Hare Airport, blocking Thomas's number on her phone. Sarah stood up slowly, smoothing the skirt of her navy blue dress. She picked up her purse. She didn't look back at the man screaming her name as he was dragged into the darkness. She simply turned to Brenda Carmichael and Arthur Caldwell, exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for 10 years, and walked out of the courtroom to go pick up her son. The heavy oak doors of the Cook County Courthouse swung open, and for the first time in a decade, Sarah Jenkins stepped out into the biting Chicago wind and felt completely, terrifyingly free. She didn't hail a cab right away. She simply stood on the concrete steps, pulling her wool coat tighter against the chill, and listened to the city. The sirens, the rumble of the elevated trains, the aggressive honking of taxi drivers. It was a symphony of chaos that she had been insulated from inside Thomas Reed's gilded cage. Now, the noise felt like a welcoming embrace. She walked down the steps, pulled out her phone, and dialed Leo's elementary school to tell them she would be picking him up early for ice cream. 3 miles away, in the sterile, windowless sub-basement of the FBI's Chicago field office, there was no ice cream. There was only the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights and the terrifying realization of absolute ruin. Thomas Reed sat handcuffed to a steel table. His custom Tom Ford suit was completely ruined, wrinkled from the physical altercation in the courtroom and stained with nervous sweat. He had been stripped of his silk tie, his shoelaces, and his platinum Patek Philippe watch. He stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, his mind desperately trying to assemble a defense out of ashes. The heavy metal door clicked open. Special Agent Robert Hughes, a veteran of the white-collar crime division with a face like weathered granite, walked in. He carried a massive cardboard banker's box, which he dropped onto the steel table with a deafening slam. Thomas flinched, the sound echoing in his skull. "David Harrison," Hughes began, his voice dripping with dry sarcasm. "Or should I say, Thomas Reed. I'll admit, Tommy, you had a hell of a run. 15 years impersonating a dead billionaire. We usually catch you guys when you buy a yacht you can't afford or slip up on a tax form. But you got caught because you couldn't stand the idea of your wife getting a dime in family court. Arrogance is a hell of a drug." Thomas kept his eyes glued to the table. "I want my lawyer. Call Richard Sterling." "Sterling?" Hughes let out a harsh bark of laughter. "Sterling formally withdrew as your counsel 2 hours ago. In fact, he's currently 3 floors up, singing like a canary to the federal prosecutor, desperately trying to secure an immunity deal so he doesn't go down for laundering your stolen assets. You don't have a high-priced lawyer anymore, Thomas. You have a public defender named William Pierce, and he just graduated law school 3 years ago. His office is a cubicle." Thomas's head snapped up, his blue eyes wide with panic. "I have money. The Cayman accounts—" "Frozen," Hughes interrupted, leaning over the table. "Every single red cent. Thanks to your wife. Sorry, the woman you legally defrauded into a marriage. We have the routing numbers, the shell company names, everything. Apex Holdings, frozen. Blue Horizon Investments, seized. The money you stole from the Harrison Trust is currently sitting in a federal holding account." Hughes pulled a manila folder from the top of the banker's box and tossed it in front of Thomas. "But that's just the money," Hughes said, his tone turning deadly serious. "Let's talk about the blood. We exhumed the empty casket in Ohio yesterday, Thomas, the one your mother buried 15 years ago, when she was told her son drowned in Lake Geneva." Thomas stopped breathing. A cold, suffocating dread settled over his chest. For 15 years, he had buried the memory of Dayton, Ohio. He had buried the memory of the cramped, smelling apartment, the unpaid bills, and the worn-out woman who had worked 3 jobs to send her genius, sociopathic son to a Swiss boarding school on a scholarship. "We brought her in," Hughes said softly. "Martha Reed is sitting in an observation room right now, looking through a one-way mirror at the son she thought was dead for a decade and a half." Thomas's eyes darted involuntarily towards the large mirror spanning the right wall of the interrogation room. Behind that glass, invisible to him, stood a frail, 68-year-old woman leaning heavily on a cane. Martha Reed was weeping silently, her hand pressed against the glass, staring at the perfectly groomed aristocratic man who wore her son's face. "She recognized you instantly," Hughes continued. "She told us about the small crescent-shaped scar behind your left ear from when you fell off a bicycle at age 7. The medical examiner confirmed it during your intake physical an hour ago. So the gig is up. The DNA is a match. The physical markers are a match. The paper trail is a match." Thomas stared at the mirror. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, and the terrified, impoverished boy from Ohio stared back. But then, the sociopathy that had allowed him to steal a dead boy's life kicked back in. He straightened his posture, ignoring the handcuffs rattling against the table. "I don't know who you're talking about," Thomas said, his voice cold and flat. "My name is David Harrison. I suffered severe trauma during the boating accident in Switzerland. It affected my memory. That woman is mistaken. The DNA is contaminated. My wife set me up because she wants my company." Hughes stared at him for a long, quiet moment. Then the federal agent slowly shook his head, a look of genuine disgust washing over his face. "You're going to let your mother grieve you twice just to protect a lie that's already dead," Hughes muttered, gathering his files. "You really are a monster. Enjoy the cell, Tommy. It's a lot smaller than the Hamptons." While Thomas Reed stubbornly clung to his shattered delusion in a federal holding cell, his empire in the outside world was being systematically dismantled. Arthur Caldwell, the private investigator, had handed over his entire dossier to the SEC and the Harrison Trust's board of directors. Arthur Pendleton, the elderly, distinguished CEO of the Harrison Trust, had called an emergency board meeting. When the FBI briefed them on the identity theft, the boardroom erupted into chaos. For 15 years, they had allowed a con artist to sit at the head of their table, signing off on multi-million-dollar developments. But the biggest shock came when Brenda Carmichael, Sarah's attorney, walked into the Harrison boardroom uninvited. She laid down the patent and copyright documents for the last 7 major architectural projects the firm had built. "Gentlemen," Brenda announced to the stunned executives, "for the last 7 years, the man you thought was David Harrison forced his wife to work in secret, designing your most profitable buildings from a locked home office while claiming the credit himself. My client, Sarah Jenkins, formally owns the intellectual property to the Chicago Spire expansion, the Riverwalk complex, and the upcoming Silicon Valley Tech campus." Pendleton, pale and sweating, adjusted his glasses. "What are you saying, Mrs. Carmichael?" "I'm saying," Brenda smiled sharply, "that the Harrison Trust has been utilizing my client's proprietary designs without a licensing agreement. My client is willing to retroactively license these designs to save your company from total collapse. But she has terms. She wants 51% controlling interest in the commercial development division, and she wants the firm restructured under the name Jenkins and Associates. It was a masterstroke of corporate checkmate. The board had no choice. Thomas Reed had stolen the Harrison money, but Sarah Jenkins had quietly, methodically, become the brains behind the brick and mortar. Meanwhile, Clara Ross's escape to O'Hare Airport had been abruptly cut short. Before she could board a flight to Milan, federal agents apprehended her at the gate. Because Thomas had been paying the rent on her luxury penthouse and buying her jewelry using stolen federal funds, Clara was facing charges of receiving stolen property. Faced with the prospect of trading her designer wardrobe for an orange jumpsuit, Clara broke down instantly. She handed over every text message, every email, and every drunken confession Thomas had ever made to her regarding his hatred for his wife and his secret offshore accounts. The circle was closed. The trap had snapped shut. There was nowhere left for Thomas Reed to run. The trial of the United States versus Thomas Alexander Reed began 8 months later in the Dirksen Federal Courthouse. It was the media circus of the decade. The tabloids dubbed him the ghost billionaire. True crime podcasters camped on the courthouse steps. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was solemn, heavy with the weight of federal justice. District Attorney Caroline Hastings, a woman known for her surgical precision in cross-examinations, led the prosecution. Thomas Reed sat at the defense table, but he was a ghost of the man who had confidently laughed in family court. 8 months in federal detention without access to his tailored suits, his expensive haircuts, or his sycophantic entourage had aged him a decade. His hair was graying at the temples, his posture was slumped, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. His public defender, William Pierce, looked perpetually exhausted, constantly shuffling through mountains of evidentiary paperwork that he had no hope of refuting. Thomas's defense strategy was desperate and contradictory. Pierce attempted to argue a complex, trauma-induced dissociative state. He claimed that the teenage Thomas Reed, traumatized by watching his best friend drown in Lake Geneva, had experienced a psychotic break, genuinely believing he was David Harrison to cope with the survivor's guilt. It was a pathetic attempt to garner sympathy, and District Attorney Hastings dismantled it within the first 2 days of the trial. She brought the Swiss medical examiner to the stand, who testified that the real David Harrison had defensive wounds on his arms, suggesting a struggle in the water, not an accidental slip. Hastings strongly implied, though she couldn't definitively prove it 15 years later, that Thomas hadn't just stolen David's life. He had actively drowned him to get it. But the climax of the trial came on the 4th day, when the prosecution called their star witness, Sarah Jenkins. When Sarah took the stand, the courtroom fell so silent you could hear the scratch of the court reporter's stenotype machine. She wore a tailored slate-gray suit, looking professional, unshatterable, and radiantly calm. She didn't look at Thomas. "Miss Jenkins?" District Attorney Hastings began gently. "Could you describe the nature of your marriage to the man you believe to be David Harrison?" For the next 2 hours, Sarah painted a harrowing, undeniable portrait of coercive control, gaslighting, and psychological imprisonment. She detailed the hidden ledger, the burner phone, and the absolute financial isolation she endured. She explained how she had slowly realized that her husband's cruelty wasn't just arrogance, but the extreme paranoia of a man living a massive, fragile lie. He was always terrified of being exposed, even though I didn't know what the secret was at the time, Sarah testified, her voice steady and clear. He projected that fear onto me. He tried to make me believe I was crazy, so that no one would ever believe me if I noticed the cracks in his facade. He used our son, Leo, as a pawn to keep me silent. He told me if I ever tried to leave, he would destroy me. Hastings nodded sympathetically. "And how did you respond to those threats, Miss Jenkins?" Sarah finally turned her gaze towards the defense table. She locked eyes with Thomas. For a fleeting second, the memory of his arrogant, mocking laugh from the family courtroom echoed in her mind. "I stayed silent," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a cool, razor-sharp whisper, "because I am an architect, and when you realize you are trapped inside a building that is structurally unsound, you don't start screaming and hitting the walls. You study the blueprints, you find the load-bearing pillars, and you quietly wire them with explosives until you are safely outside." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Thomas lowered his head, hiding his face in his hands. He was broken. William Pierce didn't even attempt a cross-examination. He knew that putting Sarah Jenkins on the defensive would only give her more room to dismantle his client. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreperson read the verdict, guilty on 2 counts of aggravated identity theft, 3 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of federal tax evasion, and 1 count of perjury, Thomas didn't react. He simply stared blankly at the wooden table in front of him. Judge Robert McNeil, presiding over the federal case, showed absolutely no mercy during sentencing. "Mr. Reed," the judge said, his voice echoing with absolute authority, "you have perpetrated one of the most callous, calculated, and prolonged frauds in the history of this district. You stole a dead boy's name, you abandoned your own grieving mother, and you subjected an innocent woman to a decade of psychological torture simply to maintain your unearned lifestyle. You are a hollow shell of a man." The judge struck his gavel. "I sentence you to 45 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. You will be remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals immediately." As Thomas was led away in chains, his eyes met Sarah's one last time. There was no arrogance left. There was no mocking laugh. There was only the hollow, terrified stare of a man who was finally, permanently, a ghost. 3 years later, the Chicago skyline looked different. Sarah stood on the balcony of her top-floor office at Jenkins & Associates, holding a steaming cup of coffee. The wind off Lake Michigan whipped her blonde hair around her face, but she didn't mind the cold. Down the hall, she could hear the chaotic, happy sounds of 10-year-old Leo playing a video game in the employee lounge while he waited for her to finish work. He was thriving. The anxiety that had plagued his early childhood had evaporated the moment they left the toxic shadow of his father. Her architectural firm, backed by the restructured Harrison Trust, was the most sought-after design agency in the Midwest. She had reclaimed her name, her career, and her life. Arthur Caldwell, the gruff private investigator who had helped her pull the thread, was now the head of her corporate security. Brenda Carmichael was her chief legal counsel. She had surrounded herself with people she trusted, building a fortress of loyalty and competence. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and looked out at the gleaming glass and steel skyscraper rising in the distance, the Riverwalk complex. It was her design. It was her legacy. She had survived the ultimate betrayal. She had endured the suffocating silence of a gilded cage. But in the end, she had proven that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. Thomas Reed had thought he could laugh her into submission. He had thought he held all the cards, but he forgot the fundamental rule of construction. The person who builds the house is the only one who knows exactly how to tear it down. Sarah's harrowing journey from a silenced, trapped wife to the architect of her own triumphant liberation is a chilling reminder that true power rarely needs to shout. Thomas Reed believed his stolen billions, and his arrogant cruelty made him untouchable, underestimating the quiet, calculating resilience of a mother fighting for her son. He learned the hard way that gaslighting and manipulation are no match for cold, hard facts and a perfectly timed trap. In the end, his mocking laughter was entirely silenced by the deafening sound of justice. If Sarah's incredible, calculated revenge and ultimate triumph left you speechless, please hit that like button and share this jaw-dropping story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more gripping, real-life sagas of justice served cold.